Hey folks, tonight we're diving into a topic the ancient Egyptians took super seriously, and sometimes, pretty weirdly, sex. From sacred rituals to downright blunt poetry, this civilization was way more open, creative, and experimental than most people today after 2 glasses of wine and checking their horoscopes. So before you get too comfy, take a sec to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where and when you're watching from. Always cool to see the global Sleepy History crew tuning in. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey. The Egyptians didn't see sex as some scandalous taboo. They treated it like plumbing necessary, functional, and ideally, not too clogged. In ancient Egyptian society, sex wasn't some hush-hush thing behind closed doors, whispered about, or awkwardly sugar-coated. It was part of nature like sunrise, the Nile's floods, or cats doing whatever the heck they wanted. The gods did it, farmers did it, nobles did it, and crucially, nobody thought they needed to feel ashamed about it. This culture didn't see sex as dirty or dangerous. In fact, it was sacred, linked to creativity, fertility, health, and personal pleasure. Not necessarily in that order. This wasn't hedonism, it was balance. Egyptian society ran on Ma'at, cosmic harmony, and sex was part of keeping that balance. Fertility meant good harvests, crops meant food, food meant survival, so if your sex life was healthy, the gods were probably smiling. If not, maybe light a candle to Hathor and think about using a little more honey. This open attitude seeped into everything: art, literature, medicine, even architecture. Temples featured carvings of reproductive gods. Houses were built with private spaces for intimacy. And yep, ancient architects were smart enough to know love doesn't bloom next to grain silos. Unlike many later societies, ancient Egypt wasn't obsessed with being single or punishing people for sex unless it involved property disputes or someone else's wife. No Puritan mobs, no complicated social ladders based on who did what with whom. Your social worth wasn't about your bedroom antics. It had more to do with how much land you owned, how good your grain harvest was, and whether you kept your linen nice and white in the sun. Wondering why sex was so casually sacred in ancient Egypt? You can thank the gods for setting the bar by making it part of their holy job description. Let's start with Adam, the original solo artist. According to Egyptian creation myths, Adam made the world by, well, getting busy solo. No sidekick, no helpers, just pure determination and alone time. From there, he created Earth's air and moisture, meaning the Egyptian universe basically kicked off with a divine one-man show. No shame in that. It was worshipped. Adam's reproductive act was seen as power, a sacred statement that life starts with desire. No fig leaves or awkward silence needed. The gods didn't blush. Why should anyone else? Next up, Osiris and Isis, ancient Egypt's royal power couple. When Osiris was murdered and chopped up by his jealous brother Set, determined and devoted, Isis pieced him back together. All of him. Well, almost all One key part was missing. So what did she do? She conjured up a replacement phallus. Yep, with magic. She brought him back to life long enough to conceive Horus. And just like that, the divine bloodline kept flowing. Now that's love. Top-notch timing. Then there's, why should anyone else do it? Next up, Osiris and Isis, the royal power couple of ancient Egypt, when Osiris got murdered and chopped up by his jealous brother Set. Isis, determined and super devoted, stitched him back together. All of him, well, almost all of him. One crucial part was missing. So, what did she do? She whipped up a replacement phallus. Yep, with magic. Brought him back to life just long enough to get pregnant with Horus. And just like that, the divine bloodline carried on. Now that's love. Great time management too. Then there's Min, god of fertility and manly strength, usually pictured tall, rocking a lettuce crown, proudly holding his most recognizable feature. Ancient statues don't leave much to the imagination. Temples for men often had lettuce offerings, symbolizing fertility, and lettuce basically their version of Viagra. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and wild joy, was another sultry character. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and wild joy, was another sultry character. Imagination. Temples for men often had offerings of lettuce, symbolizing fertility. Lettuce was basically their Viagra. Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and wild joy, was another spicy character. Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and wild joy, was another spicy character, usually naked or half naked in paintings. She represented all the fun stuff in human relationships: dancing, desire, laughter, and seduction. Festivals honoring her were basically ancient Tinder parties with drums and bells. Even the sun god Ra had his baby-making moments. Though mostly through creative speech or spit, Ra also had his important fertility moments, usually involving creative words or spitting rituals. That's just a tad less weird than Adam's solo act. The gods saw sex as sacred and necessary, and sometimes a bit experimental. They didn't separate the holy from the horny. They smooshed them together. Not every Egyptian was casting magic spells or offering sacred lettuce to fertility gods. Most were just regular folks with regular relationships, trying to squeeze in intimacy between feeding livestock and dodging crocodiles. Unlike the more dramatic gods and occasionally incestuous royals, everyday Egyptian life was pretty practical if you were a farmer, potter, or linen weaver. Your romantic efforts probably centered around neighbors who brewed good beer and still had teeth at age 30. Standard stuff. But hey, makes sense. Relationships were built on shared work, meals, and ideally feelings. Couples shared beds, raised kids together, and sometimes even sneaked love notes onto pottery shards. Yep, shards with inscriptions like "I dream of your beauty at night." That's ancient texting, folks. Sex wasn't controlled by priests or political edicts, as long as everyone agreed and it didn't mess with your job or someone else's marriage contract. It was your business. Privacy could be thin. Walls were paper thin, and nosy neighbors existed. but intimacy was respected for many couples. Physical affection wasn't. Hidden, tomb paintings sometimes show couples gently touching, holding hands, or facing each other, not just standing there like it's some formal ritual. These people really valued connection. Egyptians also got timing. Fertility was crucial. The Nile flooded right on schedule. Crops had seasons, and so did bodies. Women knew their menstrual cycles. Men took herbal supplements. And everyone had at least one auntie with unsolicited advice involving honey and onions. Birth control wasn't perfect, but was part of life. Midwifery, too. They even had pregnancy tests using barley and emmer wheat. If those sprouted after peeing on them, congrats if not. Maybe try again next year. And if things didn't work out, divorce was possible. No court drama, no public shaming, just splitting assets and going back to separate bread ovens. If you're imagining an ancient Egyptian wedding with veils, bouquets, and shy uncles doing the crocodile dance, you might want to dial that way down. The truth is, marriage in ancient Egypt was super simple. All you needed was a house, some bread, and a bit of mutual tolerance. Sharing a bed was fine. No fancy ceremonies, no priests, no registry office, no 47-course menus with chicken, lamb, or mysterious stews. If two people agreed to live together and share resources, food, linen, maybe even a goat, society accepted them as married, just like that. Done. No wedding dresses either. Women wore their usual linen clothes, usually white, sometimes pleated, always breathable. No rings, no vows, no emotional best men with scrolls of speeches. Ancient Egyptian relationships didn't need showboating. They needed practicality. After all, you had work to do. Barley doesn't thresh itself. Still, sometimes couples did write marriage contracts, especially later on. Think of them as ancient prenuptial agreements. Who brought what to the table? Family. Who gets what if everything goes sideways? Sometimes the contract even spells out punishments for bad behavior, like, if you hit me, you owe me money. Not exactly romantic, but hey, it works. Marriage contracts also boosted women's rights, something ancient Egypt was surprisingly good at. Women could own property, file for divorce, and even sue their ex-husbands if they acted weird. If love is blind. Egyptian law definitely wasn't. Actually, no honeymoon involved unless you count crashing after a big party and hoping the neighbors didn't hear the fun. But intimacy, affection, and friendship were seriously valued. Marriage wasn't just a deal, it was a partnership. Let's just get that straight from the start. Ancient Egyptians cared about loyalty, especially in theory. In practice, it was a bit more flexible, especially if you were rich, powerful, or had a really good excuse. Cheating, like lots of social sins, wasn't always a crime for regular folks. It was more of a watch your reputation thing than a legal disaster. If you got caught cheating, people would gossip loudly and maybe even root for you. But unless someone's cattle or inheritance got messed with, the government wasn't in a rush to punish you. However, if you were a married woman caught cheating, the social and economic consequences could be rough, not to mention legal trouble. Egyptian society was patriarchal, but not brutally so. A woman's fidelity was tied to issues like paternity, inheritance, and her standing as the non-disruptive member during harvest season. Accusations of adultery could lead to divorce, public shame, and in rare cases, beatings or exile, especially in fancy families where family honor was basically a full-time job. Meanwhile, men had more wiggle room. A married guy hooking up with an unmarried woman, mostly ignored. Married guy with another guy's wife. That's messy, especially if the other husband was important and didn't want to share. Jealousy isn't exactly a new thing. Texts from the New Kingdom talk about moral expectations and the big deal of having a good reputation. In some stories, cheaters are portrayed as dumb or nameless losers, while other tales say a man sleeping with another man's wife gets a tragic fate, curses, impotence, or angry gods with jackal heads included. But here's the kicker. There weren't strict adultery laws most of the time. Egyptians didn't feel the need to write laws for everything. They leaned more on shame, gossip, and sometimes passive-aggressive songs. And surprise, it worked about as well as you'd expect. If a marriage fell apart because of cheating, the divorce wasn't a huge headache. Property got split, and the community pretended not to care. Kids usually stayed with mom, especially when they were little. If your first reaction to hearing Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters was horror and a big weight, what, you're not alone. Most modern folks react the same way, but in ancient Egypt, sibling marriages and royalty weren't just accepted. Shocker, not romantic. Political, absolutely. To get this weird tradition, you have to think like a pharaoh. Imagine you believe your family literally descended from gods, no metaphor. Literally. If gods married their siblings to keep cosmic order, well, royal families should too, because nothing says eternal stability like awkward family reunions that are also wedding parties. It's not about attraction, it's about power consolidation. Pharaohs didn't want outsiders, noble or otherwise, taking the throne. Marrying a sister or half-sister kept the bloodline pure and the wealth in the family. My family claims to be descendants of gods, not figuratively, but literally. If gods married their siblings to keep cosmic order, royal families thought, why not us? Because nothing screams eternal stability like awkward family reunions that double as weddings. The point wasn't attraction, it was power consolidation. Pharaohs didn't want outsiders, even nobles, taking the throne. Marrying a sister or half-sister kept the bloodline pure and the wealth locked down tight. Basically, Egyptian royalty ran on a mix of sacred mythology and dynasty trust issues. Some of the most famous pharaohs followed this tradition. Take Tutankhamun, born of sibling marriage, confirmed by modern DNA analysis. Spoiler alert, the results weren't great. Tut had lots of birth defects, including clubfoot and a weak immune system, probably thanks to the inbreeding. The whole sibling marriage thing. Yeah, modern DNA analysis confirms it actually happened. Spoiler alert, the results were not great. Lots of genetic mess-ups, tons of congenital problems, like clubfoot and weak immune systems, which kind of proves inbreeding is a bad idea. Shocker. Meanwhile, Regular folks mostly skipped that trend. Most everyday Egyptians married outside their immediate family. Like normal functioning humans, cousin marriages popped up in rural areas sometimes, but sibling marriage, that was strictly for the gold-masked, boat-buried elite. Even royal weirdos struggled with this. When Cleopatra, yes, that Cleopatra came to power, she technically married several of her brothers, as tradition demanded, but mostly she ruled solo and then teamed up with dudes like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who luckily weren't family. From our perspective, this whole thing sounds bizarre and medically dumb, but for ancient Egyptian high society, it was just tradition wrapped in a divine logic. The holy blood had to stay pure, even if it meant sacrificing genetic diversity, because apparently keeping that divine sparkle was worth a few health problems. If you think all ancient Egyptian art is just stiff statues, awkward poses, and endless profile shots, well, you're not wrong. Unless you've seen the Turin erotic papyrus, then you know. Oh yeah, they had jokes and some seriously detailed anatomy too. While Egyptian art is famous for stoic pharaohs, serene gods, and perfectly symmetrical faces, the culture wasn't immune to a little risque flair. After all, sex wasn't taboo, so sometimes artists stitched the falcon carvings and got a little more lively. The most infamous example, the Turin Papyrus, now locked away in an Italian museum like a dirty little secret. It dates back to around 1150 BC and shows explicit scenes, not some vague mythological nonsense. We're talking illustrations of men and women, including a guy doing acrobatics on a chair, either symbolic or just showing off. Scholars debate if it's satire, porn, or both. Some say it was entertainment, maybe a bachelor's gift for someone with questionable taste. Others think it's a parody mocking everyone's obsession with fertility, filth, and those giant wigs. Besides this exception, most Egyptian porn art was symbolic and subtle. Temples didn't have Kama Sutra murals. They had fertility motifs, sacred images, and sometimes nude figures representing rebirth, creation, or divine femininity. Goddesses like Hathor and fertility gods like Min were often shown naked but respectfully. For example, Min is always shown standing upright. If you catch my drift, holding his signature symbol like a sacred badge. Then there's the use of humor and sex in doodles on the margins, animals acting like humans, exaggerated gestures, and flirty sketches on ostrich workers. Limestone bits served as notepads, basically ancient Egyptian bathroom graffiti when the supervisor wasn't looking. Egyptian sexual art wasn't about scandal. It was just another part of life, sometimes celebrated, often ritual, and occasionally hilarious. They weren't repressed. They just knew their limits and sometimes decided to spice up their papyrus. If you think ancient love poems were stiff metaphors like your beauty is like a grain silo, think again. Egyptians could carve hieroglyphs into stone, but their romantic writing was anything but stiff. These folks knew how to flirt with ink, style, and sometimes a whole lot of heat. It was ritual, but sometimes straight up hilarious. They weren't oppressed, they just had a really strong sense of boundaries. And sometimes, one day, they decided to spice up the papyrus. If you thought ancient love poetry was stiff metaphors like your beauty is like a grain silo, think again. Egyptians could carve hieroglyphs in stone. Sure, but their romantic writing not stiff at all. These folks knew how to flirt with ink, style, and sometimes zero chill. Preserved on papyrus and broken pottery shards because nothing says eternal love like a reused grain bowl. Egyptian love poems mostly date from the New Kingdom, around 1300 BCE, and they're brutally honest. Shockingly, these poems are passionate and sometimes downright steamy, like they were written during Nile flood season with nothing better to do. Here's a genuine line: I'll stay home pretending to be sick, then you'll come visit me. And, surprisingly, these poems are so passionate and sometimes downright steamy, you'd think they were penned during a Nile flood with nothing better to do. Here's a straight-up truth: I'll lie at home pretending to be sick, then you'll come visit me. And, if you get close enough, I'll magically get better. This isn't vague romance, it's flirting with a plan. Both men and women wrote these poems, often from the first-person perspective. That's pretty rare in the ancient world. In Egypt, a young woman might describe the thrill of stealing a glance across the lotus pond. A young guy could praise her singing voice as better than beer. That's the kind of worship worthy of a statue, and these aren't private diary entries. Some of these works were performed at parties, read aloud for fun, flirting, or just to fill the awkward silence between harp solos. Imagine ancient Tinder dates, live readings of passionate stanzas, followed by wine and maybe a grilled goat feast sprinkled with metaphors. Oh, they went all in. Fruit symbolized seduction. Hunting meant chasing and wooing. Gardens and rivers weren't always about farming. These poems mixed sincere feelings with cosmic worship. Desire wasn't something you bottled up. This song would be sung, written down, and maybe reread by a cousin who always reads way too slow. When you think aphrodisiacs, oysters, chocolate, or wine probably come to mind not salad, but in ancient Egypt. If someone handed you a bunch of lettuce, they weren't thinking fiber, they were flirting. Specifically, they were invoking the power of Menes, the Egyptian fertility god, closely associated with Roma lettuce for reasons both symbolic and borderline suspicious. Yep, Roma. Not just your average Caesar's garnish, but sacred stuff. Why, unlike the soft leafy greens we toss into boring lunch bowls today, Egyptian lettuce stood upright and oozed a milky white sap when cut. If that doesn't scream sacred symbol, nothing does. Ancient priests looked at it and thought, this is definitely manly power incarnate. Of course, lettuce was often offered to men during fertility rituals. Statues of men usually show him on alert, one hand holding his trademark symbol and the other clutching a stalk of lettuce. Art historians have had a field day with this combo for centuries. At fertility festivals, devotees brought lettuce bundles to his temple, hoping for his favor to boost libido, a healthy pregnancy, or just a pinch of luck in love. Min was basically the ancient Egyptian version of a dating app algorithm. Worship him right, and your odds might improve. Interestingly, There's evidence lettuce was also believed to have healing properties, especially for enhancing sexual health. Whether it actually worked or just freshened breath before a date is up for debate. But the symbolism stuck, and this wasn't just a passing fad. Lettuce shows up in art, hieroglyphs, even offerings, in tombs, as if saying, make sure I keep enjoying pleasure in the afterlife, and maybe prepare some salad too. Notably, ancient Egyptians loved natural symbolism, from the Nile's life-giving floods to the daily blooming cycle of the lotus. The physical world mirrored their spiritual beliefs. So, when a vegetable starts acting weird, you better believe it got promoted to mystical veggie status. Speaking of birth control, ancient Egyptians got pretty creative, herbal, and sometimes downright scary. With no modern science, they relied on natural substances, accumulated wisdom, and texts like the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents dating back to around 1550 BCE. One notorious recipe involved mixing crocodile dung with honey, accumulated wisdom, and texts like the Ebers Papyrus. One of the oldest surviving medical documents dating back to around 1550 BCE. One infamous prescription involved mixing crocodile dung with honey and sour powder. This was inserted vaginally as a contraceptive. Modern readers might cringe, but it's not totally nuts. This mix could create an acidic or blocking environment. Whether it worked, who knows? Whether it was unpleasant, probably a safe bet. A better bet was using acacia gum, a plant extract later confirmed by science to ferment into lactic acid, a compound that actually kills sperm. Mix that with honey and dates, and you've got yourself an ancient pessary, one of the few old-school remedies that could easily pass clinical trials. These methods show Egyptian women had some serious legal and medical clout back then. They were actively managing reproduction. Using these materials was common knowledge among midwives, healers, and women at home. Plus, there were ritual and spiritual methods too. Women could pray to fertility gods like Isis, Hathor, or Bez to either get pregnant or delay conception. Amulets and spells were mixed with practical treatments, blurring the line between medicine and religion, pretty standard for most parts of Egyptian life. Besides birth control, Egyptian medical texts also had tips on jump-starting periods, treating infertility, and even early pregnancy tests using barley and wheat seeds soaked in urine, surprisingly accurate in some cases, without modern tools. These practices show a culture deeply invested in understanding and influencing the human body. No microscopes, but definitely plenty of intention. Fertility was about life, death, economics, and divine favor. Sure, some methods sound weird now, but the drive to plan, protect, and prepare was all too familiar. In ancient Egypt, virginity wasn't some badge of honor, social currency, or fragile heirloom to guard at all costs. Actually, it wasn't a big deal at all, more like a side note in the bigger story about crops, inheritance, and not pissing off the gods before breakfast. There wasn't even an Egyptian word for virgin in the moral, ritual sense. The closest you find are terms meaning young woman or not yet initiated, more about age than purity. No torches lit, no ceremonies held, no mother-in-law inspecting the sheets like a counterfeit money hunter. This isn't because Egyptians were shameless libertines. They just had a much more practical approach to sex. It was part of life, like eating bread or avoiding hippos. Important, sure, sometimes sacred, but no need for a purity certificate stamped by temple priests. For women, value came from things like fertility, loyalty, and the skill to run a household without burning down the roof. Her sex life, mostly her own business. Marriage wasn't about signing a virginity contract. It was about building a reliable alliance that could survive tax season and plagues. Of course, modesty existed. No one went around bragging about their conquests on papyrus scrolls. But the ritual obsession with virginity found in later societies was nowhere to be seen here. No imprisonment, no morality-based dowries, no awkward uncle speeches about virtue. Even Egyptian religion didn't buy into the whole purity freakout. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and wine, was downright sensual and couldn't care less what anyone thought. The gods were too busy managing creation and cosmic balance to track who did what, when, and with whom. In the end, virginity in ancient Egypt was just a temporary state, not a lifelong subscription, and honestly, they seemed way more concerned about who could bake good bread and if your dad's roof was sturdy, because when you live in the desert surrounded by crocodiles, you quickly learn what really matters. Finally, virginity in ancient Egypt was considered temporary, not a lifelong vow, and honestly, they seemed way more interested in who could bake good bread and whether your dad had a sturdy roof over his head, because when you live in the desert surrounded by crocodiles, you quickly learn what really matters and what doesn't. Ancient Egyptian society didn't publish rainbow flags or hold parades, but they didn't seem too bothered by same-sex relationships either. No official laws condemning it, no public stonings. And the biggest shocker, no wild sermons in temples predicting civilization's doom, because two men sharing one blanket. So yeah, they noticed but didn't freak out. The most talked about example is Nyankum and Khnum-Hotep, two high-ranking officials buried together in a joint tomb at Saqqara. Their tomb had some pretty intimate artwork, these two hugging, touching noses, doing the ancient equivalent of a kiss, basically acting like a couple. The biggest debate, the color of their linen. The inscriptions call them overseers of the nail makers, which sounds harmless until you realize they were clearly close enough to be buried like a family. Were they lovers, roommates with special boundaries, brothers with a weird hand-holding habit? Scholars are still arguing, but the visual language leans toward a romantic, or at least deeply affectionate relationship. The fact their nicely decorated tomb still stands, open to the public, shows nobody was outraged. They were important, respected, and seemed allowed to be themselves even in death. Egyptian texts and myths also left room for flexibility. Some gods, like Hapi, the Nile god, were described as androgynous or genderless. Others switched roles or genders in myths without causing any divine HR complaints. Seems gods weren't bound by human categories, and their worshippers weren't either. However, no evidence exists for organized same-sex marriage or political recognition of gay unions. Egyptians were practical if the relationship produced an heir and property stability. Great. If not, that's your family's business. Intimacy, as usual, was handled with a weird mix of privacy and normalcy, while male same-sex relationships show up more in records. Female same-sex ones are almost invisible, not because they didn't happen, but because Egyptian scribes had the annoying habit of ignoring what women did when no men were around. In ancient Egypt, having kids wasn't just a nice idea, it was a social expectation, a spiritual duty, and if you were lucky, a way to make sure someone kept leaving offerings at your tomb after you kicked the bucket. So when a couple struggled to conceive, they didn't just shrug it off, they studied it with medicine, magic, or sometimes both in the same afternoon. The Egyptians tackled infertility with their classic pragmatism, their medical papyri, especially the gynecological Kahun papyrus from around 1800 BCE, include detailed diagnoses, treatments, and ways to check a woman's fertility. There were instructions on how to examine cervical mucus, track menstrual cycles, and even a crude pregnancy test involving peeing on barley and emmer wheat. If the grains sprouted, congrats, your family's about to get louder. If not, next steps might include herbal mixtures, uterine fumigation. Yes, that's a thing, or calling in higher powers, because in Egypt, if medicine fails, magic is always on standby and usually recommended. Amulets played a starring role. Symbols of Hathor, Isis, Bézis, or Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, were worn, carried, or tucked under pillows. Spells were recited, small statues were buried or placed in cradles. One text says women should drink a mix of ground dates, honey, and carob while chanting a protective spell, not FDA approved, but hey, heartfelt. Of course, men weren't off the hook, though hardly any documents mention their reproductive role. In cases of long-term infertility, the man might be advised to undergo purification rituals, consult a priest, or, less formally, just try harder. And because this is Egypt, cosmic order and spirits were always part of the equation. A childless couple might be seen as out of balance or even cursed, but society didn't shun them. Instead, it offered remedies, hope, and some surprisingly creative prescriptions, not bad considering. This effort shows Egyptian families didn't exactly need a baby factory. High infant death rates, sickness, and malnutrition kept families smaller than ideal, which only made fertility feel more sacred and its absence way more personal. Malnutrition shrunk families below the ideal size, making fertility even more sacred and its absence feel even more personal. If you think desire fades after death, ancient Egyptians would like a word, and maybe a carefully carved tombstone. In their worldview, death wasn't the end. It was just life's sequel, ideally with all the comforts, pleasures, and daily routines of the living world, including sex, funeral texts, tomb inscriptions, and burial goods all show the dead hoped to take their appetites with them to the afterlife, not just for bread and beer, but for love, touching, and intimacy, because honestly, what's eternity without a little fun? Tomb art often shows couples hugging, holding hands, or standing close in a cozy way, not just for feels, but as a spiritual blueprint. These aren't casual poses. They're purposeful messages to the gods. Please give us back our bodies, us love, and if possible, bedroom privileges. And yes, restoring the body was serious business. In the Book of the Dead and other funerary texts, the deceased are promised their limbs will work, their hearts will be fairly weighed, and, you guessed it, their bits will be restored intact. There are even references to restoring specific body parts. Nothing was considered too private to keep forever. Sex was tied to rebirth. The god Osiris, famously dismembered and reassembled by Isis, was resurrected, including a recreated phallus before giving birth to Horus. This myth wasn't just a story, it was a template. If the gods can patch up their family after resurrection, so should we. Some tomb inscriptions even plead with the gods to grant enduring love. Between spouses in the reed fields, the Egyptian version of paradise, people pictured this place as an ideal version of earthly life, with fertile land, calm waters, endless abundance, and obviously room for romance. While modern cultures often split sex into mundane and sacred, Egyptians seamlessly wove it into their afterlife ideology as something neither shameful nor forgotten. It was just another slice of soul peace, like food, music, and zero taxes. Ultimately, they hoped for what most of us want: comfort, friendship, and a little joy, even if it means mummification and some magical scrolls to get there. When we peel back the linen wrappings of ancient Egypt, figuratively, of course, we find a civilization that didn't see the human body as shameful, sinful, or suspicious. They saw it as natural, powerful, and capable of creation, both by divine will and human desire. For Egyptians, sex wasn't a secret to hide. It was a fact of life, discussed in poetry, depicted in sometimes very vivid art, and woven into the myths that shaped their worldview. The gods loved, flirted, seduced, and occasionally caused chaos involving fertility all along the Nile. In a culture where existence happened in cycles, the flooding river, the sun's return, the soul's rebirth, sex was part of that rhythm, not a disruption. They were practical. 2. From contraception and infertility treatments to love songs and hopes for the afterlife, Egyptians faced physical realities head-on, often more openly than many societies centuries later. No crazy rules, from birth control and infertility treatments to love songs and hopes for the afterlife. The Egyptians faced physical issues head-on, often way more openly than societies born centuries later. No crazy laws, no moral freakouts, no annoying censorship scribbled in the margins of sacred texts. Just Straightforward understanding. Bodies do their thing, people feel stuff, and the world keeps spinning. The key, they didn't overthink it. Sex wasn't worshipped or dragged through the mud. It was just part of health, love, family, and sometimes religion, worth respect, but not wrapped up in neurosis. Even their gods, powerful and eternal, didn't shy away from getting physical or cozy. In fact, they embodied it. And while not every practice has stood the test of time looking at you, crocodile dung, the attitude still feels pretty modern. Or maybe modern just took 3,000 years to catch up. And maybe that's the real legacy here. A culture unafraid of the body, unapologetic about desire, and somehow still managed to build pyramids on top of it all. August 24th, 1814. Washington, D.C. is on fire. Smoke columns blot out the night sky as British troops torch the most iconic buildings of this young republic, the Capitol, the Treasury, the War Department, and the President's Mansion, later known as the White House. Flames lick the roof while the redcoats stroll through the city almost casually, facing zero organized resistance. The Capitol, barely a political teenager, is defenseless, humiliation complete. The world watches in disbelief, and America turns red with shame. But to understand how it got this bad, we have to rewind a bit. 2 years earlier, the U.S. declared war on Britain, full of confidence and big delusions. Americans thought it'd be quick and glorious that they'd invade Canada, crush the British, and finally earn global respect. After all, Britain was exhausted fighting Napoleon in Europe. Surely they wouldn't have this energy to bother with a weak former colony acting tough. They were wrong. The Canadian invasion was a disaster, and a few naval wins couldn't make up for repeated defeats on land. Political divisions inside America made things worse. Some states didn't want war at all. Supplies were scarce, strategies were confused, and, worst of all, Britain never forgot. By 1814, Napoleon was defeated, and Britain had a clear schedule, with the seasoned troops ready. They focused all attention across the Atlantic, and they were ready to send a message, one that would haunt American psyches for generations. Washington, D.C. wasn't just a military target. It was symbolic. The seat of power, the pride of the Republic. And on that damp August day, it was nearly undefended because nobody really believed the British would dare attack it head on. Ironically, they did dare. Every minute was planned out. What happened wasn't a battle. It was a revenge torch parade. A reminder that the British Empire, despite the revolution, still had the power to humiliate its former colonies. And as flames swallowed the House of Representatives and black smoke covered the Capitol dome, America had to ask itself a painful question. Had they underestimated the empire they once challenged? The British didn't just show up in Washington. Their path to the Capitol was shockingly easy because Americans basically opened the door. Their landing spot was Benedict, Maryland, a quiet town on the Patuxent River. From there, British Brigadier General Robert Ross led about 4,500 troops, many battle-hardened from the Napoleonic Wars, marching toward Washington. And this wasn't a desperate attack on enemy territory. No, it was more like a lazy Sunday stroll. Why? Because Americans barely tried to stop them. President James Madison and his government knew the British were coming. They had time. Warnings came from scouts and even civilians, but bureaucracy, indecision, and selfish thinking led to a slow, messy defense. War Secretary John Armstrong Jr., in a rare denial of genius, insisted the British wouldn't dare attack Washington. They'll target Baltimore, he kept saying. Spoiler, they didn't. Brigadier General William Winder was supposed to stop the British advance. Unfortunately, Winder was better at writing reports than commanding troops. The defense force he hurriedly assembled, including the militia, mostly untrained folks, undisciplined, and a few rumored to be drunk. The number of professional soldiers was way too low. Worse yet, Winder hesitated. Instead of digging in, he kept retreating, unsure where the British would strike next. The two forces finally clashed on August 24th at the Battle of Bladensburg, just northeast of Washington. The Americans outnumbered the Brits. But guess what? That didn't matter. It was a total disaster. The militia broke ranks and ran before a shot was even fired. Some just dropped their weapons and bolted. Even President Madison showed up briefly, then wisely decided not to stick around with the amateurs. The British were stunned by the easy win and marched forward. No trenches, no barricades to cross, no desperate defense of the capital, just a straight-up smackdown. It was a comedy of errors, but nobody was laughing. When the Brits reached Washington, U.S. leadership fell apart into chaos. Madison fled. Government documents were stuffed into crates. First Lady Dolly Madison, refusing to leave the White House rudely, packed up valuables, including the famous portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. As night fell, the redcoats marched in, matches nearly lit, when the British entered Washington. The city was almost deserted. Politicians had fled. The streets were eerily quiet. The only sounds, British boots and the crackling of fires from earlier skirmishes. Major General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn led their troops with precision. No looting, no chaos, just disciplined mission making a statement. And what a statement it was. The British Army started with the capital. The building was still under construction, but the North and South Wings Congress's chambers were finished enough to represent the pride and function of the U.S. government. The Brits burned both wings down. Flames engulfed the Library of Congress. Books and manuscripts, some irreplaceable, turned to smoke. This wasn't just a military hit. It was a cultural slap in the face. Then they moved to the White House, called the President's Mansion back then. Dolly Madison escaped, but not before saving the iconic portrait of George Washington. The British found the building empty, but dinner was still laid out, untouched, in possibly the most awkward meal in history. British officers sat down to enjoy the president's dinner before setting the place on fire. The destruction was almost ceremonial. Cockburn, nursing a personal grudge against Americans for mocking him in political cartoons, reportedly burned the offices of anti-British newspapers and even stood in the House Speaker's chair, taunting. Should this Yankee Democratic seaport be burned? Oh, it most certainly shall. Within 2 days, every building was torched: the Treasury, War Department, Navy Yard, and Arsenal. Even the bridge over the Potomac was burned to stop any counterattacks. But despite the thorough wrecking, some spots survived. The Patent Office was saved thanks to a brave American, William Thornton, who convinced the Brits it served all humanity, not just the U.S. government. The destruction wasn't random. It was surgical, meant to humiliate. The Brits didn't plan to conquer Washington. They wanted to shame it, and with every building collapsing in flames, their message got louder. This wasn't a raid. It was punishment, and the smoke would linger far beyond the ashes. Just as the British launched their brutal conquest of Washington, something weird happened. The sky darkened, the wind picked up, then came thunder. An unusually fierce storm, later called a hurricane by some, hit the capital. Like nature itself decided the city had suffered enough. The rain poured down, snuffing out many of the fires the British started. One house was burned down: the Treasury, War Department, Navy Yard, Armory, even the bridge over the Potomac went up in flames to stop counterattacks. Still, despite thorough checks, some spots were saved. For instance, the Patent Office was spared because a brave American, William Thornton, convinced the Brits that this office served all humanity, not just the U.S. government. The destruction wasn't random. It was surgical and meant to humiliate. The British weren't trying to conquer Washington. They wanted to shame it. And with every building collapsing in a sea of flames, their message got louder. This wasn't just a raid. It was punishment, and the smoke would linger far beyond the ashes. Just as the British kicked off their fierce conquest of Washington, something strange happened. The sky darkened, the wind picked up, then came thunder. An unusually violent storm, later called a hurricane by some, hit the capital. Like nature itself decided the city had suffered enough. Rain poured down, putting out many. Fires started by the Brits. Strong winds could rip off roofs and even toss cannons off the ground. One British soldier reportedly got hit by flying debris. The storm got so intense that British officers started fearing it was God's judgment, a punishment for burning a defenseless city. Then, almost like prophecy, a tornado swept through downtown Washington, D.C. Yep, a real tornado. It tore through the town center, tossing strollers and debris around like they were toothpicks. Buildings collapsed, trees snapped in half, and British soldiers got tossed to the ground. Confused and panicked, the British command, already packing up, took this as a clear sign. Their message was sent loud and clear. Maybe sticking around longer was tempting fate. They bailed the next day, mission accomplished, and their shoes were almost dry. For Washington, the storm was both a curse and a blessing. On one hand, it caused more destruction, wrecking already damaged buildings and flooding the streets. On the other, it helped put out the fires and possibly stopped the city's total annihilation. It literally wiped out the British presence in the minds of many Americans. This storm became almost legendary. Clergy called it divine intervention. editorials praised the hand of providence. Even grizzled soldiers whispered that God stepped in to protect the capital when humans couldn't. Of course, nature doesn't pick sides. The storm couldn't rebuild the city or bring back lost lives, but symbolically it marked a turning point. The fires died out, the British left, and what remained? Smoldering ruins, wet ashes, broken pride, was still American. The storm became a strange kind of salvation, with no military power to save it. Washington was rescued by something else, a force, uncontrollable, unpredictable, and maybe, in its own weird way, a savior. The worst was over, but rebuilding the soul of a nation was just beginning. The British were gone, the fires were out, the storm had passed, but what they left behind wasn't just ashes and rubble, it was psychological wreckage. Washington, D.C. lay in ruins. The Capitol was just a blackened shell. The president's mansion was now a pile of rubble. Government offices were destroyed, furniture tossed or wrecked. To many Americans, especially those in the Capitol, this devastation felt like a second revolution, except this time, the enemy had marched in victorious. The whole country faced a haunting question: should Washington remain the capital? Many thought it was over. This argument made sense. Washington was always a compromise built on a swamp that didn't charm the southern states. Now, after disgrace and fire, it looked like a failed experiment. Some in Congress pushed for moving it. Philadelphia, New York, or even Baltimore might serve better cities, with actual defenses, with dignity intact. But others pushed back. Among them, a stubborn president named James Madison. Though he fled the city during the attack, he quickly came back and vowed this humiliation wouldn't happen again. His wife, Dolly, who became a symbol of tender care in rescuing the nation's treasures, stood by him. Together, they insisted the city would rise again. Rebuilding was slow. Funds were tight. Morale was even worse. Congress met in temporary quarters, first in the Patent Office, then in a makeshift brick building called the Old Brick Capitol. Every session reminded lawmakers what they'd lost. But burning Washington sparked something unexpected: determination. Ordinary folks, craftsmen, and laborers all pitched in to restore the city, brick by brick. The Capitol rose again. Architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe returned to oversee the recovery. His designs included improvements, sturdier materials, a bigger vision. The president's mansion was rebuilt, eventually whitewashed to cover the burn marks. That's how it got the famous nickname we know today, the White House. Instead of being abandoned, Washington became a symbol of American resilience, a reminder that even after the deepest humiliation, a republic can survive and rebuild. And though the scars remained, both tangible, mixed with their feelings, they grew tougher, turned into sheer determination. Washington wasn't just going to vanish because the real capital of a nation isn't just buildings, it's faith. That fire in Washington wasn't just a hit on architecture, it was a punch to the nation's pride. Up until then, a lot of Americans thought the War of 1812 was a joke. a political blunder wrapped up in patriotism. But when the British burned the heart of the Republic, the country woke up. Panic swept across the East Coast. If the capital could fall that easily, what city could be safe? Baltimore, Philadelphia, even New York suddenly. The war got very real, very close, and very dangerous. Divided opinions hardened even more. The old Federalist arguments saying the war was unnecessary and poorly managed started to sound almost treasonous. Even President Madison's critics had to admit time for bickering was over. The nation had been slapped in the face and needed to respond. Militias were mobilized. Local defenses were beefed up, especially Baltimore, which was gearing up for what many expected to be the British's next target. People dug trenches, built fortifications, and loaded guns at the harbor. The British fire didn't just burn buildings in Washington, it lit a fire in the American spirit. But it wasn't just fear spreading, it was defiance. Newspapers ran fiery editorials, demanding revenge. Preachers kept preaching righteous justice. Artists painted stirring images of Dolly, Madison, and burning buildings, turning disaster into folk heroism. From the ashes, a story began to form, not of defeat, but of resilience, a weird transformation. Loss that could have crushed spirits instead sparked nationwide unity. Sure, there was shame, but also a burning desire to prove the U.S. wasn't just a fragile democracy experiment. It could take a punch and keep standing. President Madison, once cautious and kinda unpopular, suddenly became a hero. He stood amid his ruined capital, vowing to rebuild. And the image of a battered but tough republic struck a chord. The Brits hoped to humiliate them. They ended up galvanized. The war wasn't over, but America had finally started fighting back, not just with muskets, but with meaning. If Washington was the slap, Baltimore was the punchback. Just weeks after torching the capital, the British set their sights on Baltimore, a major port and home to pirates who loved to mess with British ships, riding high on Washington's success. The Brits figured Baltimore would fall just as easy. Wrong. When the Redcoats marched in, mid-September 1814, Baltimore was ready. Locals, workers, even slaves worked round the clock to fortify the city. Over 10,000 volunteers dug trenches, built walls, and loaded heavy cannons at Fort McHenry. This wasn't going to be an easy win. The British tried the classic two-pronged attack, a land assault from the east and a naval bombardment from the Patapsco River. But from the start, things went sideways. General Robert Ross, the guy who marched triumphantly into Washington, was taken out by an American sniper early in the land battle. His death hit British morale hard and threw their command into chaos. Meanwhile, at sea, the British fleet launched a 25-hour bombardment of Fort McHenry. Rockets streaked across the sky. Bombs exploded all night. But the defenders stood firm. They refused to surrender, even as the fort shook under fire. Then came the morning of September 14th, as smoke cleared and silence returned to the harbor. The British expected to see a white flag. Instead, they saw something else, a giant American flag waving. defiantly over the fort's walls. The flag, sewn by Mary Pickersgill, stood 30 feet tall, waving in the morning breeze, like an upraised middle finger to the Empire on a British ship. An American lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched it all unfold. The man showed up to negotiate prisoner release. But what he saw that night inspired him to scribble a poem on the spot. The opening line, "Oh, can you see the dawn's early light?" The Brits realized Baltimore wasn't going down. They retreated in shame. This time, American grit wasn't about speeches. It was about trenches, stubbornness, and refusing to back down. Baltimore survived, and because of that, faith in the American cause was reignited. A burned capital sparked the war, but a bombed fortress lit this fire of identity. After Baltimore, everything changed. The U.S. went from global embarrassment to suddenly standing firm. The British, hoping for a quick end, with a knockout blow in Washington, now faced growing resistance and less wind in their sails. Their war machine was slowing down, stressed by logistics and political pressure. They started rethinking the cost of dragging this out. Baltimore's defense wasn't just a military win, it was psychological. It gave American negotiators a solid stance, and in today's quiet Belgian town of Ghent, talks between British and American diplomats entered a new phase. At first, the Brits were asking for a lot. They wanted a buffer zone for Native Americans in the Midwest, control over parts of the Great Lakes, and that even some territorial concessions. But the American diplomats, especially John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, refused to budge. They argued from resilience, not desperation. Then the Brits started blinking. The European War had drained them. Post-Napoleon Britain had to manage domestic unrest. Trade disruptions were hurting both economies. The U.S. refusal to surrender after Washington and Baltimore's defense shifted the whole perspective. This war, it turned out, wasn't going to be won by fire alone. By December 24th, 1814, both sides agreed on the Treaty of Ghent. Basically, it was a tie. No land changed hands, no reparations paid. The draft one of America's main gripes wasn't even mentioned, but no one wanted to admit defeat, so they agreed to go back to pre-war conditions, everything as it was, and in one of history's weird twists, one of America's biggest wins, the Battle of New Orleans, happened 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Thanks to 19th century slow mail, that victory delivered the emotional win Americans desperately needed. The war ended not with a dramatic surrender, but with a mutual shrug. Yet, for the U.S., it felt like more than that. They survived the Capitol's burning, rallied in Baltimore, and walked away with their sovereignty and pride intact. And just like that, the so-called Second War of Independence was over. Washington's embers still glowed, but from those ashes, a new American identity began to take shape. Burning Washington wasn't just a war tactic. It turned into a defining national trauma. Yet in that strange way, history works. That ultimate humiliation gave birth to something quietly powerful identity right after. Americans had every reason to feel defeated. Their capital was a smoldering ruin. Their president had fled. Their army collapsed in battle. But the story didn't end there. Actually, it was just beginning. From that destruction grew a collective refusal defined by loss. Rebuilding Washington wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was about defiance, memory, and renewal. The new Capitol and White House became architectural symbols of national resilience. The act of rebuilding sent a political message to the world. We're still here, and it worked. On paper, the war ended in a stalemate, but in the American imagination, it became something else entirely. The idea of a young, disorganized republic that could challenge the world's greatest empire burned, beaten, but never broken, started cementing a sense of exceptionalism. The War of 1812, especially the burning down the Capitol, marked a coming-of-age moment for the U.S. It also forced the country to change. The government started taking national defense more seriously. Fortifications along the coast got an upgrade. The military, long ignored since the Revolution, began getting better funding and more strategic organization. Regular folks started seeing themselves differently too, not just scattered citizens of separate states, but part of a national experiment culturally. That fire left a mark. Francis Scott Key's poem, inspired by the defense of Baltimore, became the national anthem over a century later. The term White House came about after the post-fire renovations and stuck as the official name. Dolly Madison's bravery turned legendary, and the city that once seemed like a lost cause became the undeniable heart of the nation. Even the British later looked on with awkward silence. Sure, they won militarily, but diplomatically, not so much. Their flames might have burned buildings, but they couldn't burn the American spirit. In the end, burning Washington wasn't just a collapse. It was the spark that tested and proved the resilience of a republic, still learning how to stand tall, and that fire, meant to humiliate, ended up fueling the American spirit instead. In medieval Europe, motherhood often started before a girl even fully left childhood. A girl's value, status, and even salvation often hinged on her ability to have kids, especially boys. Nowadays, motherhood might be a personal choice or just biology, but back then, it was a social duty. So women weren't just expected to be mothers, they were destined for it. Marriage was the first step. Among peasants, families arranged marriages to merge land, labor, or livestock. Among nobility, marriage was political chess. A noble girl might be married off at 12 or 13, sometimes younger. Even just engaged, her body was already pledged to a future alliance. Fertility wasn't just a blessing, it was bargaining power. After marriage, the pressure to get pregnant hit immediately. Wives who couldn't conceive, after a year or two, faced whispers, suspicion, ridicule, and sometimes accusations of moral or spiritual failure. If a noblewoman couldn't produce an heir, her husband might annul the marriage or worse, take a more capable mistress. In the aristocracy, a woman's womb was national property. A kingdom's rise or fall depended on whether the queen could birth a healthy son. Pregnancy brought not just joy, but anxiety. The stakes were sky high. A son meant dynastic continuity. A daughter wasn't useless, but definitely not ideal. Peasant women faced less dynastic pressure, but didn't get off easy. Kids were workers. Bigger families meant more hands to farm, tend animals, and help parents in old age. But with high infant mortality and zero knowledge of maternal health, every pregnancy was a gamble. Motherhood wasn't a choice. It was an expectation, a calling, even a form of penance. The church taught that Eve's sin cursed women with painful childbirth. So motherhood was both duty and punishment. Women were praised for silent suffering, accepting their role without complaint. By medieval standards, a woman who couldn't bear children was a freak, or worse, a failure. The womb wasn't private property. It was public asset, holy machinery, and dynastic infrastructure all rolled into one, and for most women, it decided not just their lives, but their deaths. Childbirth was a battlefield, and the mother was a lone soldier. No white-coated doctors, no sterile tools, and definitely no painkillers. Instead, dim rooms, wooden chairs, herbal remedies, and silent prayers mixed with constant fear that this might be her last birth. Labor usually happened at home, whether rich or poor. Most women gave birth with help from other women midwives, female relatives, and neighbors. Men rarely around. In fact, childbirth was considered a strictly women's business, sacred and dangerous. A midwife might have some passed-down wisdom, but no fancy formal training. And if something went wrong, like a breech baby, stalled labor, or hemorrhaging, well, nobody really knew what to do. People just expected pain. The church said it was God's will. Original sin from Eve supposedly cursed women to suffer childbirth pain, making it a spiritual virtue to endure agony without complaint. Women weren't allowed to cry loudly. That meant weakness or worse, sin. Some tried soothing the pain, though. Herbal potions from poppies, mandrake, or deadly nightshade could dull the pain, but they were sketchy and sometimes dangerous. Usually, women relied on saints, charms, and rituals. St. Margaret's girdle was a popular talisman wrapped around the laboring mom's belly for protection. Relics were hidden under beds. Hymns were sung. Midwives made the sign of the cross before cutting the umbilical cord. But death still lurked nearby. Maternal death rates were shockingly common. Women died from blood loss, infection, or retained placenta days after birth. Some survived labor, only to die of what we now know as puerperal fever, usually from unwashed hands or dirty linens. Estimates say 1 in 10 births ended with the mother's death. For poor women having many babies, the risk only got worse. Premature births were common too. Babies born too early, too tiny, or too weak. And if a baby died unbaptized, that raised terrifying questions about their soul. In this world, childbirth wasn't just biology. It was danger, prayer, and repentance. Every new life was teetering on the edge of death. Bringing a baby into the world was just the start. The real fight for both mother and child was survival in the Middle Ages. The odds were brutal. Nearly half of all kids died before age 5. Some didn't even manage their first breath. Others died of sickness before they could walk. The first year was the deadliest. Fevers, infections, and malnutrition were ruthless killers, and medical knowledge was basically non-existent. Peasant moms bore the brunt of this harsh reality, living in cramped dirt floor homes, surrounded by animals, drinking from polluted wells. They battled illness daily, diarrhea, respiratory infections, and tetanus were common killers. No antibiotics, no vaccines, definitely no hospitals. Even a mild fever could turn tragic. Noble women lived cleaner, easier lives, and had better access to food, but they weren't exempt. Disease didn't care about titles. Plague, smallpox, measles, it hit royalty and peasants alike. High birth rates among nobles weren't just about producing heirs. It was a numbers game for survival. One son wasn't enough. You needed backups. This brutal fact shaped how mothers viewed their children, especially in early years. Parents often delayed naming babies until they survived infancy. Some moms avoided bonding early on, not from coldness, but necessity. Grief was a constant visitor. Burying one child was a tragedy. Burying many was just life. But love stuck around. Fierce, painful, desperate love. You see it in letters, wills, prayers scribbled in manuscript margins. You see it in mothers walking miles for healing herbs or calling priests for last-minute baptisms. They didn't just mourn their kids. They fought for them with everything they had. In the early years, parents often delayed naming their kids until they survived infancy. Some moms opposed bonding early on, not coldness, just necessity. Grief was a constant guest. Burying one child was a tragedy. Burying many was just normal, but love still lived on. Fierce, painful, desperate love. We see it in letters, wills, prayers scribbled in manuscript margins. We see it in mothers walking miles for healing herbs or calling a priest to baptize before death. They didn't just mourn their kids. They fought for them with everything they had. The emotional toll was huge. No therapists, no mourning leave, no grief counselors. A mother might lose a child on Monday and be back, doing chores by Tuesday. Fields needed plowing, fires needed stoking. Life went on, whether your heart was ready or not. In medieval motherhood, hope and heartbreak walked hand in hand. Every birth was a miracle. In medieval motherhood, hope and heartbreak were always hand in hand. Every birth was a miracle. Every survival was a tiny rebellion against brutal odds. For noble women, motherhood wasn't just personal, it was political. A noble woman's uterus was crown property, a tool for alliances, dynasties, and succession plans. Her pregnancy was monitored more closely than most medieval wars, and every child, especially sons, was a public win or a crushing loss. The pressure was immense. From the moment she married, a noblewoman's sole job was to produce an heir, not just any kid, but a healthy, legitimate boy. A queen who couldn't pull that off risked being ditched. Kings could always find a servant, a mistress, or even a new wife. Just ask Anne of Bohemia or Catherine of Aragon. A noblewoman who struggled to conceive wasn't just infertile, she was politically useless. Even if a child was born, the mother's job was far from over. Her role turned into one of anxious supervision. She didn't have to raise the kids herself. Nurses, tutors, and governesses handled day-to-day care, but she was expected to oversee their education, secure their future, and guard their reputation like a hawk. The mothers of future kings endured court gossip, factional plots, and endless manipulation. Their sons were pawns before they could even walk, betrothed before they could talk, and turned into daughters-in-law. These kids were marriage tokens, often sent off to foreign courts as teenagers and sometimes never coming back. But noble moms weren't always distant or just good at applying makeup. Some wielded serious power through their kids. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just give birth to kings. She advised them, corrected them, and once even led a rebellion against one. Margaret of Anjou led armies to defend her son's throne. Isabella of France orchestrated her husband's deposition on behalf of her son. These ladies weren't passive moms. They were political operatives in velvet and lace. Motherhood also brought misery, miscarriages, illness, assassination, exile, royal kids, not safe at all. The higher the rank, the deadlier the game. Emotionally, noble mothers lived on edge. They had status, but not much say. Love for their kids was real, but tangled up with duty. They were expected to sacrifice their bodies, privacy, and even maternal instincts for the family's sake. If noble women carried dynasties, peasant moms carried the full brutal, raw, unromantic weight of survival. For medieval peasant women, motherhood wasn't a phase, it was life. It started young, ended late, and rarely offered a break in between. These women often married in their mid-teens and kept having babies throughout their 20s and 30s. With no reliable birth control and the church condemning every method, pregnancies were basically non-stop. Each baby was another mouth to feed, but also potentially another pair of hands to work the land. Peasant women gave birth at home. No doctors, no clean sheets, no privacy. Sometimes a neighbor midwife pitched in or not. Some women delivered alone in barns or fields, then got back to work within hours, praying they didn't bleed out under the open sky. Death during or after childbirth wasn't rare, and nobody sent condolences. Life was harsh, fast, and indifferent. Child-rearing started the moment the umbilical cord was cut. No maternity leave here. Babies were swaddled tight and either carried by mom while she worked, or laid in cradles near the fire, watched over by older siblings, or sometimes not watched at all. Crying wasn't spoiled or soothed. It was just background noise to the daily grind. Mothers taught their kids by example, working hard, surviving, and getting the job done. Crying was just part of the soundtrack to their relentless labor. These moms weren't just caretakers. They were tough role models who lived survival every day. How to feed chickens, gather firewood, pull weeds in the garden, and patch clothes. Even toddlers got assigned chores like fetching water or delivering messages. Every kid had to pitch in. Childhood, as we think of it, innocent, protected, full of toys, and school didn't really exist. Still, despite the struggle, there was love. Mothers singing lullabies, braiding daughters' hair, whispering prayers as they laid their kids down on shared straw beds. Love showed up in foods, warmth, sacrifice, a mom sharing her bread with a hungry child, a barefoot mom so her son could wear her only pair of shoes to church. Being a mom in the countryside was basically a masterclass in endurance. These women carried not just babies, but burdens, firewood, expectations, grief, their backs bent under the weight of a world that never stopped, even when burying a child. And they kept going. In the medieval world, feeding infants was biology, and hierarchy rolled into one for most moms, especially peasants. Breastfeeding was non-negotiable. It was natural, expected, and vital for survival. No formula back then, and animal milk was risky and often contaminated. A mother's body was the only life source. Peasant moms breastfed as long as possible, usually until the toddler wandered off because they had no choice. Breastfeeding wasn't just nutrition, it was also a basic birth control method, slowing down reproduction, a lucky break in a world of almost constant pregnancies. These women worked fields with babies strapped to their backs, pausing to feed them between planting and harvest, but in noble families. The rules changed. Upper-class women often saw breastfeeding as beneath their station, physically exhausting, emotionally inconvenient, and culturally inappropriate for a refined lady. Enter the wet nurse. These were small women chosen for their health and milk supply, paid to breastfeed full-time. They usually lived with the child and formed deep mother-child bonds, sometimes even stronger than the birth mothers. The church had mixed feelings about this. Some theologians worried a child suckling from an immoral woman might inherit her sins. Others saw wet nurses as a practical necessity for women wanting to keep having kids. After all, a queen couldn't risk wasting time on one baby when she needed to get pregnant again. Infant care was brutal by modern standards. Swaddling was basically mandatory. Babies were tightly wrapped to straighten limbs and keep them from moving around too much. Diapers existed, but were usually rag scraps or moss pads reused and rarely changed. Baths were rare. Teething was treated with charms or folk remedies. Cribs were hard as rocks, if they existed at all. Babies often shared beds with parents, increasing the risk of suffocation. Sickness hit fast. Treatments ranged from herbal potions to praying to saints. And if a baby died, especially young, some believed it was God's will or worse, punishment for the mother's sins. Still, moms did what they could. They rocked, soothed, fed, and sang lullabies. In languages long forgotten, love found its way, even in the mud and darkness of medieval life. In medieval Europe, motherhood wasn't just manual labor, it was spiritual work too. The church deeply influenced the experience of pregnancy, birth, and child rearing. Everything from conception to burial was steeped in religious meaning, and a mother's soul was closely scrutinized before giving birth. Women often begged saints for protection. Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially loved by expectant moms. Legend says she escaped a dragon's belly unharmed. So, motherhood wasn't just hard work, it was spiritual work. 2. The church deeply influenced the experience of pregnancy, childbirth, and raising kids. Everything from conception to burial was steeped in religious meaning, and a mother's soul was always under scrutiny before giving birth. Women often begged saints for protection. Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially beloved by expectant moms. Legend says she protected women in labor because she once escaped unharmed from inside a dragon's belly. Prayers were said, her image worn on charms, and whispered her name through contractions. According to the church, childbirth was tainted by sin. Thanks to the story of Eve, women were taught that labor pain was punishment for humanity's original fall. So, even at the happiest moment, when a kid is born, the mother's hit with a reminder of her original sin guilt trip. And if she dies, well, her soul's in some serious spiritual danger. Once the baby arrives, baptism becomes the urgent next step. The fear of uncertainty was very real. If a baby died before baptism, many believed its soul wouldn't get to heaven. Sometimes, midwives were allowed to perform emergency baptisms if the newborn was too sick to wait for a priest. The idea of eternal damnation for babies sounds terrifying, but it was pretty standard medieval theology. Superstition filled in the gaps left by doctrine. Mothers tied charms to cribs, hung herbs over doorways, or drew protective symbols in ash on the floor. The evil eye, wicked fairies, and nasty spirits all got blamed for sickly babies or miscarriages. Some moms whispered secret names to confuse the spirits that might try to snatch their kids. The church also controlled how women rejoined society after giving birth. Baptism, usually around 40 days later, was a purification rite. Until then, the mother was seen as spiritually unclean and barred from public worship. The ceremony was meant to bless and welcome her back, but also served as a polite reminder. Childbirth, while necessary, left a mark of shame despite harsh theology. Many mothers found comfort in faith. Prayer was protection, ritual reassurance, and hope tucked somewhere between psalms and pain. Once the baby survived infancy, the next phase of medieval motherhood kicked in, shaping a human tough enough to survive this brutal world. That meant discipline, harsh truths, and often early goodbyes for peasant moms. Education wasn't about books. It was survival skills. From toddlerhood, kids were expected to pull their weight. Girls gathered firewood, fed chickens, hauled water. Boys learned to tend animals, use tools, and followed dad into the fields. Moms were the first teachers, showing kids how to knead dough, spin wool, or patch up old clothes. These lessons were practical, hands-on, and passed down like family heirlooms. Discipline was strict, but not necessarily cruel, in a world where disobedience could mean death. A wandering kid might drown in a well or get kicked by a horse. Strictness was a form of love. Corporal punishment was common, but so were rewards. A warm meal, a kiss on the forehead, a song by the fire. Affection and correction often went hand in hand. Nobles had a different schooling style. Boys were sent off to become squires or guards, usually before age 10. Girls sometimes went to convents or noble households to learn court etiquette. embroidery, and all the fancy manners of the palace for noble moms. This often meant handing over their kids early, sometimes never really raising them again. Doesn't mean they didn't care. Letters from noble women show deep concern for their children's health, marriages, and reputations. A noble mother might not tuck her kids in every night, but she was usually pulling strings behind the scenes, playing chess with their futures. Still, the emotional pain of separation was very real. Kids might be raised by strangers, cared for by others, and married off by age 15. A mother might hear about her child's death from a messenger, or never hear at all. Yet medieval moms found ways to stay connected through prayers, keepsakes, and traditions. They passed down songs, names, and customs, deeply imprinting their lives on descendants, near or far. The medieval mother wasn't the primary caregiver. It was about preparing to let go early, often, and without guarantees, being a chess master. Still, the emotional pain of being apart is very real. Kids could be raised by strangers, cared for by someone else, and married off at 15. A mother might hear her child died from a messenger, or never hear at all. But medieval moms found ways to stay connected through prayers, keepsakes, and traditions. They passed down songs, names, customs, embedding them deep into their kids' lives. Near or far, the medieval mother wasn't a full-time daycare. It was about preparing to let go early, often, and without guarantees. Medieval moms rarely left handwritten records, no diaries, no bestsellers, but their fingerprints are still everywhere, in lullabies that survived, in traditions handed down, in prayers etched on chapel walls, and in the bones of the children they raised through all the hell. Their love wasn't like ours. No baby showers, no ultrasound pics on the fridge. Love was quiet, practical, and often hidden behind the need to keep emotions locked up. After all, when so many kids died young, loving deeply meant risking getting your heart ripped out. Yet, moms loved fiercely, patiently, and endlessly. We find the traces of that love in the margins of medieval texts, where a woman scribbles her missing child's name next to a prayer, in queen's letters begging for news of their kids, in old shoes left on graves, in folk tales where mothers risked their lives to keep their children safe. This wasn't weakness. These were acts of defiance in a world that constantly tested a mother's strength. Loss was a constant companion: stillbirths, malaria, plague, war. A mother might raise 10 kids and bury 6. Mornings were private, often quiet, but carried a lifetime of weight. Grief wasn't always spoken aloud, but it was never absent, and they endured. They gave birth without drugs. They bore the shame of a lord and the pain of losing children again and again. They endured church oversight, society's demands, and the limits of their own bodies. Some endured violence from husbands. Others faced exile, poverty, or starvation. But through it all, they nurtured, protected, taught, and hoped in the most miraculous way. Their legacy isn't carved in stone, but lives on in generations. They're the nameless ancestors who kept us alive, clothed us, and somehow made everything happen. They laid the groundwork for family and survival, even when they probably shouldn't have. Medieval motherhood wasn't holy or gentle. It was tough, complicated, heartbreaking, and brave. Sometimes joy, sometimes tragedy, but always alive in every sense. These women were the silent architects of the medieval world, and though history rarely carves their names into castle walls, the kingdoms they built through their labor, the choices they made shaped the future, and their sacrifices still echo in us long after cradles are empty and prayers have faded. Long before we spotted Jupiter's moons or Saturn's rings, humans stared up at the night sky amazed, armed with barely any tools. In the pre-telescope world, the universe was a vast, unreachable painting. People tracked stars, pinpointed planets, and marked seasons, all with the naked eye, and that eye, impressive as it was, had limits for most of human history. The sky was more interpreted than studied. Ancient cultures turned constellations into stories. Orion was a hunter. Scorpio was a scorpion sent by the gods. The Greeks called wandering lights planets because they moved differently than fixed stars, but no one really knew what they were. Were they trains, crystal balls, or magical lanterns? No one had a clue how to look closer and find out. Observation meant standing under the stars and jotting down whatever you could actually see. Tools like the astronomical labs built by Islamic astronomers helped track celestial movements with shocking precision. Babylonian and Mayan folks kept meticulous calendars and even predicted eclipses. The Greeks whipped up mechanical gadgets like the Antikythera mechanism to calculate planet positions, but no one could see farther than the naked eye allowed, which meant space stayed more mystery than reality. The idea of zooming in was just curiosity. People got mirrors? Sure, but refraction light bending through lenses was still a big old puzzle. Optics was in its baby shoes, and nobody thought about applying it to stars. More importantly, nobody imagined the sky could actually change. Heaven was perfect, eternal, and unchanging, Aristotle's divine orderly kingdom. Meanwhile, Earth was chaos and decay. That belief stalled science for centuries. Why bother building a device to check something you're already sure is flawless, yet the questions kept bubbling under? The ones humanity can't stop asking. What are stars made of? Why do some lights move while others don't? Is Earth really the center of everything? None of these had answers in a world with no way to peek beyond its borders. No way, until some lens makers, fixers, and one curious Dutch dude changed the game, long before humans dreamed of stargazing. People were bending light accidentally. Mind you, early lenses might have been pure luck. Clear crystals like quartz or cylinders could naturally magnify objects if shaped right, polished and rounded by hand or nature. These stones sometimes revealed odd things. Objects looked bigger through them. For our ancestors, that must have felt like magic. Around the first millennium BCE, the Assyrians crafted what we now call the Nimrud lens, a stone crystal that could magnify or focus light. Its exact purpose is still debated. Was it a science tool or just decoration? Either way, it proves people started realizing light could be controlled. Jump to ancient Rome, where reading stones popped up hemispherical glass pieces placed directly on text to magnify letters below. The ancestors of magnifying glasses and a direct link in the optics evolution chain. These tools didn't explore the sky, but they gave humanity a clue that vision could be improved. The real leap didn't happen in Rome, but during Islam's golden age, in the 10th and 11th centuries. A scholar named Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Alhazen, revolutionized the study of light. He didn't build telescopes, but his work laid the theory for how they'd work later. Alhazen experimented with lenses, mirrors, and water to figure out how light moves and bends. He proposed vision isn't from the eye shooting rays out, as many thought, but light entering the eye, a concept so obvious now, it's hard to believe it was once controversial. His Book of Optics explained refraction and reflection, shaping the science of light centuries before Europe rediscovered it. Though these thinkers never applied their theory to stars, they built the mental foundation future inventors needed. Their works, once translated into Latin, spread across medieval Europe, setting the stage for the optical boom of the Renaissance. By the 13th century, optics quietly slipped into everyday life, not through astronomy, but a much more personal issue: bad eyesight, in bustling Italian glass workshops, especially around Venice. Glassmakers started crafting lenses to help aging monks and scholars read. Their manuscripts, voila, eyeglasses. The first pairs appeared around 1285, probably, in Pisa or Venice. They were simple convex lenses framed in wood or metal, designed to sit snugly on your nose. No temples, no arms hooking behind your ears. Users just had to pinch them into place or hold them with their hands. But hey, they worked. No fancy side pieces, just pinch and go. Efficiency at its most minimalist. A booming industry, even if they had no clue about the physics behind what they were selling. But that new obsession with magnification sparked a wild idea. If glasses could help us see tiny things, could they help us see things far away? This didn't happen overnight. For centuries, lens making was a humble craft focused on personal needs, reading books, threading needles. But in that context, knowledge about convex and concave lenses slowly got better. Craftsmen started experimenting with lens shapes. Scholars copied and built on old Arabic texts about refraction. The tinkering got bolder. The Renaissance, full of passion for discovery and invention, fueled this fire. Experimenters began combining lenses, sometimes just to mess around, sometimes chasing real innovation. Eventually, someone accidentally hit on a setup that did something amazing. It brought distant objects closer, according to most records. That someone was Hans Lippershey, a Dutch lens maker who, around 1608, put together a device that could magnify distant things. Wasn't perfect, but it worked. His invention, a simple tube with two lenses, was called the telescope. It had the power to change war, navigation, and even our view of the cosmos. But Lippershey wasn't the guy to explain it all. That took a different kind of thinker, part scientist, part showman, and totally unafraid of challenging the heavens. When news of Hans Lippershey's telescope reached Italy, one man saw what others didn't, a way to challenge the very structure of the universe. That man was Galileo Galilei, math professor from Pisa, with a knack for experiments and a deep skepticism of accepted truths. When he heard about the Dutch device in 1609, he didn't just want to copy it, he wanted to improve it within months. He built his own telescope, first 3x magnification, then 8x, and soon after 20x, compared to Lippershey's clunky tool. Galileo's scope was sharper, longer, and way more sophisticated. Then he pointed it at the sky. That moment was historic. Through his homemade lens, Galileo became the first person to really see the heavens. What he found shattered the perfect divine order Aristotle preached and the church defended. For example, the moon wasn't a smooth glowing ball. Galileo saw craters and mountains' imperfections. The Milky Way wasn't a faint blur. It was made up of countless stars. Jupiter, thought to be just a wandering light, had 4 moons orbiting it like tiny celestial satellites. He named them the Medici stars after his patrons, but today we know them as the Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. And the most mind-blowing Venus showed phases like the moon, proving it orbited the sun, not Earth. With every observation, Galileo was stabbing the old geocentric model right in the heart. Turns out Earth wasn't the center of everything. The universe was bigger, stranger, and way more dynamic than anyone imagined. Galileo published his findings in Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, in 1610. It was a bombshell, a celestial prophecy. Crowds gathered. That was a historic moment. Through his homemade lens, Galileo became the first person to actually see the sky up close. What he found shattered the perfect divine order Aristotle preached, and the church desperately defended. For example, the moon wasn't some smooth, glowing orb. Galileo saw craters and mountains utter imperfection. The Milky Way, not just a fuzzy cloud. It was made of countless stars. Jupiter, thought to be just a wandering light, had 4 moons orbiting it, like tiny celestial satellites. He named them the Medici stars after his patrons. But today we call them the Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, and wait for it. The most mind-blowing thing, Venus has phases like the moon, proving it orbits the sun, not Earth. Every observation was another stab at the old geocentric model. Turns out Earth wasn't the center of everything. The universe was bigger, weirder, and way more dynamic than anyone imagined. Galileo dropped his findings in Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. In 1610, a cosmic mic drop. Crowds gathered to check out his telescope. Scholars praised him. The church, not so much. the telescope became dangerous. It challenged centuries of theological dogma. The sky, once thought unchanging and sacred, looked messy, shifting, and alive. Galileo didn't just invent astronomy, he turned vision into a weapon, and with just a few polished lenses, he kicked off the epic showdown between observation and old-school beliefs. The heavens, once considered perfect, now looked chaotic and full of motion. Galileo didn't just invent astronomy, he turned sight into a weapon, and with a few polished lenses, he started a war between observation and tradition and belief. Stars would never be safe or silent again. Galileo proved the power of two lenses in one tube, but Galileo's design a convex lens in front. A concave lens in the eyepiece had its limits, narrow field of view, blurry edges, and magnification dropped off after about 30 times. Johannes Kepler was the famous German mathematician known for planetary motion laws. When he read Sidereus Nuncius in 1610, Kepler asked a simple question: could optics be better within a year? He came up with the dioptric theory, a treatise that rewrote the lens rules. Kepler suggested swapping Galileo's concave eyepiece for a second convex lens. The image would flip upside down, but the payoff was huge: wider field of view, sharper focus, and theoretically unlimited magnification. Kepler himself never built one. He spent his life juggling power struggles, plagues, and family tragedy, but his design spread across Europe like contraband. Craftsmen caught on. In Italy, Francesco Fontana made long, bulky instruments, some up to 6 meters, with power up to 160 times. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, Christian Huygens and his brother pushed lengths beyond 30 meters to hunt Saturn's rings. But the first verified Keplerian telescope showed up in the 1630s, possibly made by Jesuit astronomer Christoph Scheiner. He showcased it for the emperor in Vienna. Fancy courtiers squinted through right-angle eyepieces on distant church towers, even though everything was upside down. Upside-down view was a small price to pay for clarity. Still, it sparked a new market, building smart eyepieces and diagonal mirrors for land observations. Craftsmen in Paris and London competed to sell astronomical versus terrestrial models. Telescopes stopped being scientific oddities. They became luxury items for nobles eager to brag about spotting ships before they docked. Meanwhile, Kepler's optics ignited serious science. With sharper images, astronomers mapped sunspots, sketched lunar valleys, and timed Jupiter's moons so precisely they proposed using them as celestial clocks to figure out longitude. Telescopes had evolved from disruptive gadgets to essential tools, yet every extra inch of focal length made lenses sag and the glass go fuzzy. The race was on for shorter telescopes with bigger power. This challenge would summon a genius who hated color smudges and loved apples: Isaac Newton. The vision race wasn't over, it just changed shape. By the mid-1600s, refracting telescopes had gotten absurd. To boost magnification, astronomers made scopes longer than houses, some over 100 feet. Just to fix the bumpy floor problem, Chromatic aberration was a rainbow smear around bright objects. When light passed through curved lenses, colors split like a prism, creating a blurry halo. No matter how carefully lenses were shaped, colors stuck around. Then Isaac Newton appeared, not just understanding the problem, but refusing to accept it. Already famous for calculus and gravity, Newton turned his sharp brain to optics. His solution? Stop using lenses altogether. In 1668, Newton dropped a game changer, the reflecting telescope. Instead of bending light through lenses, he used a curved mirror to gather and focus it. Mirrors don't split light into rainbows. They don't need to be hundreds of feet long. And best of all, they could be short, powerful, and precise. Newton's design used a concave primary mirror at the tube's bottom, reflecting light to a hundreds of feet long, and the best part, they could be short, powerful, and sharp as heck. Newton's design used a concave primary mirror at the bottom of the tube, bouncing light to a flat diagonal mirror, then up to an eyepiece on the side. It looked nothing like Galileo's telescope, but boy, did it work. The images were sharp, clear, and best of all, no annoying color distortion. At first, Newton kept his invention under wraps. He wasn't a fan of public fuss, but by 1672 he showed it off to the Royal Society, causing quite a stir. This was a compact device that outperformed much larger refracting telescopes. Observers could now study Jupiter's rings, Saturn's rings, and the moon's bumpy surface in stunning detail, all from the backyard. Not some fancy cathedral rooftop. Of course, reflecting telescopes had their own headaches. Making a perfect parabolic mirror. Yeah, that was tough. Early models used polished metal that tarnished fast and needed constant buffing. But the core idea was revolutionary, and its potential totally undeniable. Newton's invention didn't replace refracting telescopes overnight, but it cracked open the limits of what telescopes could do. Astronomers suddenly had two competing options: lenses or mirrors. Pick sides: lenses or mirrors, and as mirror tech improved, Newton's quiet revolution reshaped astronomy's architecture. The universe hadn't changed, but how we saw it took a giant leap forward. By the 18th century, telescopes left the hands of craftsmen and entered the era of national pride, royal sponsorship, and scientific ambition. Telescopes weren't just clever gadgets anymore. They became weapons in the battle to understand the cosmos. Across Europe, astronomers used them more than ever. One towering figure stood out in this era: William Herschel, a German musician turned self-taught astronomer. Herschel moved to England and became obsessed with the night sky. With the help of his smart sister, Caroline Herschel, he started crafting massive reflecting telescopes in his backyard, melting metal, casting mirrors, hand-grinding lenses. One of his designs stretched over 40 feet long with a 4-ton mirror. That was the biggest telescope on Earth back then. And with it, he made history. In 1781, Herschel discovered Uranus, the first new planet found since ancient times. This shook astronomy to its core. Suddenly, the solar system was way bigger than anyone imagined. Herschel didn't stop there. He charted thousands of stars, cataloged nebulae, and coined the term galaxy. He even guessed some fuzzy patches through his telescope might be entire distant universes beyond our own. Meanwhile, Caroline became a respected astronomer herself. She discovered several comets, refined star charts, and published groundbreaking catalogs, working tirelessly alongside her brother at their observatory. Elsewhere, telescopes helped scientists solve long-standing puzzles. Astronomers tracked Venus's movements to calculate the distance from Earth to the Sun. Telescope measurements improved celestial navigation, letting ships sail across oceans with way better accuracy. Naval empires literally depended on the sky, while Newton's reflecting telescope remained king. Achromatic refractors, those fancy lenses that cut down on rainbow blurs, were hitting the market. Optics pros like John Dolland sharpened images without that annoying color smudge, delivering perfect clarity and color correction. Observatories popped up all over Europe, Paris, Berlin, Greenwich. Astronomy got institutionalized. Telescopes moved off scholars' attics and into towers, domes, and royal palaces. They became symbols of enlightenment and empire. This was the golden age of stargazing telescopes. Not only broadened our view, but also our place in the universe. As the 19th century dawned, telescopes entered the industrial age. Those early copper and glass tubes became precision instruments made of steel, brass, and cast iron. The sky, once lit by candlelight, was now charted with the growing power of factories, railroads, and empires. The biggest change size, telescopes got gigantic in Ireland. A wealthy astronomer named William Parsons, the third Earl of Ross, built the largest telescope on Earth at the time. Finished in 1845, the Leviathan of Parsonstown boasted a 6-foot wide mirror and a 50-foot long tube hung between two massive stone walls. It looked more like a siege weapon than a science tool, but it worked. Parsons used it to observe the swirling structure of what was then called the Whirlpool Nebula, now known as M51, producing one of the first sketches resembling a spiral galaxy. No one had a clue how far away it really was, but this drawing hinted that the universe might be packed with systems like our own, way beyond the Milky Way. Meanwhile, observatories popped up in France, Russia, and the US. When the 19th century rolled around, telescopes went industrial. What started as copper tubes and hand-cut glass became precision instruments made from steel, brass, and cast iron. The sky, once lit by candlelight, was now mapped with the growing power of factories, railroads, and empires. The biggest change size, telescopes got huge in Ireland. A wealthy astronomer named William Parsons, the third Earl of Ross, built what was then the largest telescope on Earth. Finished in 1845, the Leviathan of Parsonstown boasted a mirror 6 feet wide and a 50-foot long tube hung between two giant stone walls. It looked more like a siege weapon than science gear, but it worked. With this beast, Parsons observed the swirling structure of what was then called the Whirlpool Nebula, now known as M51, and made one of the first sketches resembling a spiral galaxy. Nobody knew how far away it really was, but this drawing hinted that the universe might be packed with systems like ours, way beyond the Milky Way. Meanwhile, observatories popped up in France, Russia, and the US. Astronomers stopped being lone geniuses in robes and became observatories popped up in France, Russia, and the US. Astronomers stopped being lone geniuses in cloaks and became salaried researchers with government support, budgets, and grants. Telescopes started moving west toward drier air, clearer skies, and higher altitudes. One of the most famous was the Lick Observatory in California. Built atop Mount Hamilton in 1888, it housed the largest refracting telescope ever made, with a 36-inch objective lens, not to be outdone. The Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin debuted an even longer refracting telescope in 1897, still the largest of its kind today. But refractors were hitting their limits. The lenses sagged under their own weight. Telescopes this big just couldn't. So the future swung back to mirrors. Engineers started experimenting with silver-coated glass, lighter and easier to maintain than Newton's old metal mirrors. Reflectors, once overshadowed by lens telescopes, were making a comeback. Meanwhile, photography showed up on the scene. For the first time, telescopes weren't just for eyeballing the sky. They could capture images. Astronomers started taking long exposure photos of stars, nebulae, and planets, seeing deeper than ever before. The age of pure observation was ending. The age of data had begun. As the 20th century dawned, telescopes transformed from mere peepers into discovery machines, no longer limited to what the eye could see. They started collecting data across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, revealing secrets visible light always hid from us. The revolution kicked off atop Mount Wilson in California, where George Ellery Hale pioneered the Hooker telescope, finished in 1917 with a 100-inch mirror. It was the most powerful telescope of its time, and staring into that mirror was a young astronomer named Edwin Hubble. In the 1920s, Hubble used the Hooker to observe the Andromeda Nebula. What he found changed everything. Andromeda wasn't just a cloud in our galaxy. It was a galaxy itself, one among millions. Hubble's work shattered the idea of a small, static universe. Turns out, the universe is huge, expanding, and so old we can't even measure it. Soon enough, even Earth's atmosphere became a nuisance. Our air blurs starlight and blocks much of the electromagnetic spectrum. So, by mid-20th century, telescopes started getting lifted higher on balloons, planes, and finally into orbit. In 1990, NASA launched the Hubble Space Telescope, a namesake orbiting above Earth's distorted atmosphere. After some early mirror hiccups, Hubble delivered the most detailed cosmic images ever captured: gas pillars, dying stars, newborn galaxies. It peered deeper into time than any human eye ever had. And Hubble was just the beginning. Radio telescopes like Arecibo and a massive array in New Mexico let scientists listen to space. Infrared telescopes uncovered mysterious objects hidden in cosmic dust. X-ray telescopes spotted black holes gobbling up matter. Every new telescope type unlocked another layer of the universe. Then came the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, way more sensitive than Hubble, designed to look back over 13 billion years to galaxy birth. Not just an eye in the sky, but a time machine built with golden mirrors and hardcore math. From Galileo's shaky wooden tube to helium-cooled space observatories, telescopes have turned into something truly mind-blowing. We don't just see the universe anymore. X-ray telescopes caught black holes gulping down matter. Every new kind of telescope unveiled a whole new cosmic layer. Then came the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, way more sensitive than Hubble, designed to peer back over 13 billion years to the birth of galaxies. Not just an eye in the sky, but a peer back over 13 billion years to the dawn of galaxies. Not just an eye on the sky, but a time machine built with gold-coated mirrors and deep math. From Galileo's shaky wooden tube to space observatories, the journey continues. Cooled by liquid helium, the telescope evolved into a truly amazing gadget. We weren't just looking at the universe anymore. We were decoding it, and with every new lens, mirror, or frequency unlocked, we got closer to answering the big question. Let's get started. Is there anything else out there